Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to Alaska Book Week. And for today's event, author Michael Engelhard is going to be interviewed by David James. And before they get started, I want to introduce them. David has reviewed books since 2006, and since 2014, he has written for both Anchorage Daily News and the Fairbanks News Miner, reviewing books. Currently, he writes profiles on writers and creators for both publications. Michael, who has a background in cultural anthropology, has written 12 books, which is pretty impressive. And currently, he moonlights as a freelance writer for various publications and continues to write books. So I'm going to let you two take over.
Good to see you again, Mike.
Yeah, nice seeing you, David.
Let's just start right off with the new book and have you talk about what you wrote and what readers can expect.
That's No Place Like Nome, the Bering Strait seen through its most storied city. Me and my wife, we lived there from 2011 to 2014. And because she had a job for the state of Alaska as a public health nurse, which was pretty interesting. She got to fly out to all these outlying communities, the Bering Strait Islands, Little Diomede, and St. Lawrence. And I started writing a lot of articles. It felt a little bit like, what Matryoshka dolls are, the Russian dolls that they sell that are nested one inside the other and another one, smaller one inside. And that's what Nome felt like to me. So you find a story, you get really excited, you dig down, and then there's more and more stories. And so at some point, I've been writing these as articles for Alaska Magazine over the years. And I thought, this is just one of the most incredible places I've ever lived in, culturally and biologically. It's at the same latitude roughly as Fairbanks, but it totally feels Arctic, treeless, and then also culturally, you got Inupiaq and Yupik culture, the Eskimo culture influence there in Nome. So it feels like it's much farther north than it actually is. Anyway, at some point, seeing the material that had accumulated over the years, I figured I want to make an entire book about Nome because A, there isn't one, and then B, I got really more and more into history in my latter decades of my life. And there's just so much history in Nome. It's just incredible. And then you find, once you start researching the history, that basically anybody who was anybody in Arctic history passed through there. I mean, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but from Wyatt Earp to Roald Amundsen to Edward Sheriff Curtis for his last book in the North American Indian series went to Nome. And, you name it, they've been there. Also discovered a really interesting, to me, nature writer that's sort of, in my book, on the level of Rachel Carson, but is much, much lesser known, Sally Carragher, who wrote a series of books and did some research while she was living in Nome. She ended up buying an old miner's house there and wrote a book about for which she studied natural history. And she had basically lemming burrows in her house, upstairs and downstairs, so she could study the animals in detail. I mean, characters like that, you don't find one or two in the history of Nome. You find dozens of them.
Now, when you sent me the information on the book, you said that this is the first book you've had with a primarily urban outlook as opposed to wildlands. And I did note that when you published Cold Flashes, which is an anthology of Alaska writers, you did include quite a bit of urban material in that one as well. And I'm wondering what prompted you to kind of pivot back to that side of Alaska?
I think the lines that we draw between the front country and the back country and the city are sort of arbitrary, and as part of, the ecology teaches that all these habitats or places are connected. And so I think it's foolish, and I learned this the more I read and the more I live and the more I see and look around me, that it's just foolish to separate the cities from the rest of the environment, especially since now, 9/10 of humanity pretty soon will be living in cities. And that's where the political decisions are made. And that's where we're going to save the environment coming from these administrative centers, the cities. And for the cold flashes, I just wanted to be all inclusive. And there were just a lot of writers. And it's still writing. You can still write about nature and be in the city. Bill Sherwanit is one of those writers who makes a strong case for that Anchorage. And, you just had a second bear attack there on one of the trails outside of Anchorage. So is that city or is that wilderness? So to me, it's sort of like it's all part of the par for the game, and it's all game for the writer's game. So I don't distinguish there anymore. And for the Nome book, I actually use the city only as a lens through which to look at the larger region, because it epitomizes a lot of the developments in the history that have occurred in the Bering Strait region.
It's interesting knowing that what the river knows seems like it had kind of a precursors to that, because you did write about Fairbanks and Cordova and Nome in there. So it seemed like you were already kind of moving that direction, do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I never even noticed that till you pointed it out, but maybe there's a bit of a trajectory because, as I age, I have to admit I don't spend as much time on hardcore trips in the backcountry as I used to. So maybe my world has shrunk in a way, but I think, again, that's the interface between civilization and nature. That's where the real interesting stuff is, like the essay collection that we mentioned, What the River Knows. I really enjoyed writing this one chapter about describing that battle I had, the battle of wits between me and the red squirrel that kept raiding our bird feeder there in the yard.
Mm-hmm. I remember
which I ended up losing that battle.
Yeah, I remember too. You described mosquitoes as predatory in the same way almost as polar bears, and not really at the top of the food chain when you think about mosquitoes. And I enjoyed that.
Yeah, keeps you humble. Comparing and the small stuff, the big stuff, the polar bears per se are not more important than the little stuff. The mosquitoes have a function too in the environment. Sure, they're a pain in the neck, but so if you live in Kaktovik, so can be polar bears.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the start. You were born in Germany. We discussed
Yes.
this when I interviewed you before. You came here following a military stint, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and a bunch of other failed endeavors. I had an apprenticeship, 3 years apprenticeship as a potter and so on. And maybe I was just putting off university. I didn't want to go directly from high school to college, to university. Got some life experience under the belt. That's when I actually, after a stint in the military, is when I first traveled to the United States in 1982. And I hitchhiked basically for half a year through the country, ended up down in Mexico and Guatemala. And in those days, there was the intercontinental missile crisis, the whole political brouhaha when they were going to station those in Europe. And Americans were not well liked. And I was sort of prejudiced too. But then that trip that I did, where I met people from all kinds of walk of life, really changed my mind as far as Americans go. I was taken in, for example, by a Hopi family on the Hopi mesas. And, people took me home and turned over their house to me and said, well, I got to leave, but here's the key to the house and the fridge is full. Make yourself at home. And that literally, coming from Europe, that blew my mind. So I really revised my opinion of American people, and also, of course, fell in love hard and fast with the national parks and the wilderness areas, which is an absolutely unique institution that I was not prepared for.
And you did dive right into the Southwest initially, which has remained part of your writing, a significant part of your writing, several of your books, and clearly a secondary anchor for you, I would suspect. And maybe talk about how that came into your life and how that sent you on your way to Alaska.
I have a split personality. I have divided loyalties. I love both places, Alaska in particular, the Arctic up there, and then the Southwest, the Canyon country. And so I've been keeping going back and forth, spent years here, spent years there, and never really settled down, which is kind of not a sustainable lifestyle, because you got to grow roots eventually somewhere. And it's easier to do that in one place than in every time I come back, people I used to know, they moved on and I got to start from scratch again. But the Southwest is actually where I became a writer. I had this years and years ago, decades ago, actually, I read somewhere that when they flooded the Colorado River in Glen Canyon, that 120 some canyons got drowned. And that number stuck in my shoe like a pebble or like a burr under my saddle, and I kept thinking, what does that mean? What does that mean? Is it on paper? It's just a number. So I got a wild hair up my butt. And one year I decided to hike 120 canyons on the Colorado Plateau within a year. So I quit my job and just hiked these canyons. And I was not a writer. I had written academic papers at that point, but never considered even becoming a writer of books or journalism articles or anything. And I kept a journal. And at some point, I thought, you know what? I realized at first that the building of the Glen Canyon Dam down there and flooding into what now turned into Lake Powell it was just the most visible event as far as degrading the environment. But there were other things going on, like overgrazing, mining, even tourism development, that were still destroying these places or compromising them on a daily basis. And I got to thinking that maybe there's a story there that people would like to know about. And so I took those notes and I tried to get them published. Of course, nobody wanted to read about 120 canyons, but eventually, by a long process of winnowing and editing and rejections and the usual route that a lot of writers go, I arrived at my first book, and that was Where the Rain Children Sleep, A Sacred Geography of the Colorado Plateau. And that was in 2001 now, so it's been a quarter of a century almost.
And I'm seeing on your webpage several comparisons to Edward Abbey, who I think a lot of us in a certain age range were pretty heavily influenced by. I know I went through my period. I kind of have some criticisms of him now that I didn't recognize when I was younger, but he was a fantastic writer.
He was a model as a writer for a long time, but not necessarily as a human being. The more I learned, and I'd like to think matured, the more I saw the problematic sides of him, like his stance towards women and immigrants and so on. Being one myself, so.
So how did you come? Well, you got the anthropology degree before you came north, or was that up here? I'm unclear.
Well, actually, it was. I started when I finished my military service, came back from a hitchhiking trip in the United States. I did that apprenticeship as a potter. It was in southern Germany, and I had a friend who lived in Munich. And so one day I went to Munich and visited with him and just went up to campus to check out what anthropology courses they were offering, just for kicks, because that's something I've become really interested over the years, the stay with the Hopi family being one incident. And just on short notice, I just enrolled and embarked on an anthropology degree. And then 1 year into my studies, I applied for a scholarship and an exchange year at originally it was the University of Edmonton, Alberta. I had a grant. I had a fund, grant money for that. But I had been to Edmonton before, and it's a big city. It's very cowboy, and there's a lot of oil, and it's a long way from the mountains. And then one day I saw a photo taken on the West Ridge of UAF, the campus there, where you can see Denali on a clear day. And I decided, screw Edmonton, I'm going to Fairbanks. And of course, there wasn't a scholarship for that. And so friends said, you crazy to let all this money go? And I said, I don't care, I'm going to Fairbanks. And in retrospect, it turned out to be one of the most momentous decisions of my life. Because of course, I ended up staying. I got a teaching assistantship, a research assistantship, and got out to do amazing field work in Northwest Alaska. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So the degree was from you, was what I was a little unclear on.
My master's degree was from UAF. My undergraduate work was in Munich. And then once I finished the master's in Fairbanks, I embarked on a PhD, which I aborted. I had everything but dissertation. I was a lousy grant writer. I shouldn't admit this as a writer, but I couldn't get the money for the field work I was planning to do for my PhD, which I was trying to do in Arctic Village with the Gutchin.
What drew you? What was your first impression when you arrived? Fairbanks is kind of a rough city when you first see it.
It was just, I was just like the Energizer Bunny, because I came there in August. It was a month before the wall came down in Germany, so I wasn't even there for all that excitement. And I stayed at on West Ridge. They had a little walk-in campground that now is leveled and gone. And I stayed at that campground in a tent in the birch forest there. And the sun was just up 24 hours a day almost. And the people, I ran into these amazing people right away. I was hitchhiking. They hadn't gotten my luggage was separated from me. So I hitchhiked back to the airport there in Fairbanks and picked up my luggage, which included a big suitcase. And I was hitchhiking down there on Farmer's Loop, trying to go out to a place of a person I knew, and had my suitcase on my head because my arm was being ripped out of my socket carrying that suitcase. And there was a woman that promptly stopped and picked me up. And then another guy picked me up, turned out to be a fellow German, let me stay in his cabin for a while. And then he moved to another cabin. I ended up moving into his cabin and became a longtime friend too. And I was totally sold on the place right away. Of course, it was buggy then too.
And has Fairbanks remained your primary home base, or has it moved around more than that?
I don't identify a primary home base anymore. It's planet Earth as far as I'm concerned. Like I say, I have split personality, loyalties, and I don't know where home is anymore. You know, it's out in nature, for lack of a better word, but also, you know, wherever I get my mail to.
Okay. You told me before that when you abandoned the PhD, you just headed out to be a wilderness guide and a raft guide, if I recall.
Yeah, it was a little more. It wasn't just that I couldn't get the grant money. I also ended up teaching some summer sessions up in at Fairbanks at UAF. And I realized that I'm not the greatest classroom teacher. You know, I was teaching a class, among others, that was called Native Cultures of Alaska, which among other things, is required for teachers new in the state to take so they get an idea of what kind of situations they're going to get into culturally. And I was really appalled at I have to say, at the ignorance of some of these people that I was teaching, and also like trying to cover 12 plus Native Alaska cultures in 6 weeks. It's just insane. You know, it's just, you bombard people with all this information and you don't know what sticks, what's going to stick or what's going to make a difference. Anyway, I realized also that when I thought back that my important lessons I had not learned in school, but in the outdoors. And so I tried to find a niche to combine my interest in education with the natural world, and guiding was right there. You know, it's the beginning of the season and I got hired, and these two components, the education about nature, still influences much of my life, including my writing, of course.
Now, is this when you dove into the backcountry of Alaska, or were you already getting around quite a bit?
It wasn't my very first, and this is another embarrassing story. My very first dive into the Alaska wilderness was at the end of one period in which I was doing field work for the Park Service in Northwest Alaska. I just had finished interviewing a bunch of elders in the village of Ambler. And then in my megalomania, I just said, since I'm done here and, you know, I got time to spend and I got money to burn, so I'm going to hike from Ambler to Anaktuvuk and then take the plane back from Anaktuvuk Pass to Fairbanks. And when I announced my plan to the elders, you know how they are. They don't tell you you can't do that or you shouldn't do that. They just shake their head and say, interesting, you know, and they let nature do the rest. And sure enough, I was a half a day out of Ambler, bushwhacking in the boreal forest, already semi-lost. I hear this huffing and puffing and trees breaking, and I come over this rise, and there's a big old grizzly, a male grizzly, just tearing the trees apart. Of course, I thought he was angry, but what I didn't know, he was probably just looking for grubs in the tree bark and stuff. But it scared me so badly, I turned right around and hiked back to Ambler and came in there with the tail between my legs, barely daring to look the elders in the eye because they'd already known I was green-oared. I was never going to make it to Anaktuvuk. So that was my first official introduction to the Alaska wilderness.
But you kept at it, and especially you gravitated into the Arctic. So perhaps you could tell us the story of your growing adventures and how they led you through Alaska.
In a sentence, I don't like trees. And people always laugh when I say that, but I really do love wide open landscapes. And that's something the Arctic and the American Southwest actually have in common, among other things. They're open spaces, the long sightlines, spare vegetation, the geology stares you right in the eye. And so I was introduced to that like I mentioned, in Alaska, that landscape through the Park Service work that we did. My professor at the time, Dr. Linda Ilana, was the principal investigator, and we did a multi-year study for Gates of the Arctic and Kobuk, because, as you know, in Alaska, if Native people can prove that they historically have been using areas now within the parks, they're still entitled to do their subsistence activities there. That's very different from the lower 48, where the Park Service has actually removed Native people, starting with John Muir and those guys, has removed Native peoples in order to establish national parks in the area. So that's Kotzebue, the coast, is where I really fell in love with the Arctic. But I had already long been in love with the boreal forest, with the Fairbanks area, through the work of Richard Nelson, whose books, especially on the Koyukon, Make Prayers to the Raven, I had read as a graduate student. And I had watched the video series that he made about Make Prayers to the Raven too. So culturally, that very much attracted me, the Northern Athabascan groups. And now in retrospect, if I'd been exposed to the Arctic sooner, I probably would have specialized on Inupiaq and Yupik people instead of Athabascans. That's part of the growth that you undergo.
Now, you're writing.
It's not necessarily growth.
Okay. You're writing. You have been all over the state. In the most recent book, your essays go from the southeast all the way up into the northwest of the state. They don't sit there just in the Arctic, and so you have explored widely coastal areas, interior areas, Arctic areas. What's kept you going?
Well, see, the thing is, you say I explored widely, but I don't explore widely as far as globally widely. I only go explore in two places now. That's Alaska and the Colorado Plateau. So as a young man, I thought it would be more important to climb 1,000 different mountains. That's the Chinese proverb anyway. And now, as I've gotten older, I think it's more important for me to explore the same mountain 1,000 times. Of course, it's not always the same mountain, but I try to stick to the regions that I care about, that are my spirit homes, and to delve deep, instead of being all over the globe and being always only scratching the surface. For me as a writer and as a human being, that helps me to better to really understand the places and to forge connections, even though I'm still a nomad within these parameters.
So I think my question, maybe to clarify, was that are you saying that Alaska in its entirety is a passion? Because you write about the Southeast, you write about Cordova, you write about Nome, you write about Fairbanks, you write about the Arctic. In that book, you were discussing quite a few areas of the state, more than most collections by a single author will do. And so am I correct in thinking that it has more to do with Alaska in its entirety rather than just one region?
Alaska is not a place. It's a myth. And that myth, I was influenced even before I became a student of anthropology, as a teenager, too much Jack London in my susceptible years. That's how I sometimes describe it. And there's this whole idea of Alaska as this rough north where you can go as a young man and prove yourself, I mean, that's all that Jack London's writing's basically about. And so I haven't quite transcended that yet. I know that in one respect, it's naive that Alaska is a place in many ways like other places, and yet there's a lot of things that are very different. I mean, we have more things in common, I think, the state of Alaska with Hawaii than we do have, for example, with a state like Alabama. And you could spend a whole lifetime of writing books and trying to put your finger on what it is that makes Alaska so special. And that's one of the things that makes me coming back to it as a place and also as a subject for my writing. So yes, to answer your question in short, it is Alaska as a whole that has captivated me, as I hope I have shown in that essay collection, What the River Knows. And work also has taken me into different parts of Alaska. I had summer trips in Southeast Alaska where I worked for an educational outfit based out of Bozeman, Montana, Wild Rockies Field Institute. So I work courses for them. I work courses for Outward Bound out of Seward. So, I have been all over the state through my anthropological work, through my guiding, and lastly, through my wife's job, because she has been transferring. We lived in Cordova for a while, then we lived in Nome, we lived in Fairbanks twice. So we're really the ultimate gypsies in a way.
This brings to an interesting question for me. And this goes back, I picked up on this even with your book, The Ice Bear. Is that correct? Let me look again. I reviewed that one in the Dispatch. Yeah, Ice Bear. And how you've really moved away. And we discussed this in our previous interview too, that you've moved away from the term wilderness. And you said you like wildness. And I've kind of gone the same direction where I feel like I think I put wild lands when I write about it, because wilderness sort of implies that it's unoccupied, and there have been people here for tens of thousands of years.
Yes.
You can discuss that in relation to the places you've been.
Yeah, wildness is a state of mind, whereas wilderness is a place. And I'm more and more interested in interior states than, well, I shouldn't say more than in places, but, traveling through the entirety of Alaska's Arctic for my traverse of the Brooks Range from the Canadian border to the Bering Strait in 2012, which resulted in the memoir Arctic Traverse. It made me realize, not for the first time, because I'd seen that already when we were doing the research for the Park Service, which was place names analysis, where we looked at maps and where had people gone and what had they done there, that there is really no place. People might not live there anymore, but there's evidence of people in the past having lived there, whether it's in the form of archaeological artifacts or stories or landmarks, names on the maps that unfortunately didn't make it on Western European or Anglo maps, because, that's part of the colonial pattern, naming is claiming. So, but there's a little museum in Anaktuvuk Pass, the Simon Paniak Memorial Museum, which for many years I've not had the time to go there. And then one day I finally said, I got to take the time to go there. And they have a mural, I would call it even. It's a like 30 feet wide by 6 feet high display of just a tiny part of the Central Brooks Range, the vicinity of Anaktuvuk Pass, basically, and showing all the places that people have been going and some of the stories that have happened there, ranging from shamans' graves to battles with the Indians that they've had. And that thing looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. So there's your idea of wilderness, Well, we cannot keep this concept up of wilderness being unpopulated, because by doing that, we separate ourselves again from the rest of nature, which is an artificial separation, and which is also part of what ails us in these times, that we make this the same as the difference between the city and the backcountry. The same distinction is that one we make between humans and non-humans, or wild and the civilized. It's all a gradient as far as I'm concerned.
So let's shift into writing and how you became a writer, how that started and then built momentum.
Well, as I already mentioned, the precipitating event was that year-long project of hiking those 120 canyons. And like I said before, nobody wanted to read about 120 canyons. So it was interesting. I had the manuscript basically shelved. And then one day, and here's my shout out to small independent bookstores. One day I walked into this semi-famous small bookstore in Moab called Back of Beyond, which is you'll find all collected Edward Abbey's first editions in there. And it was actually started by one of Edward Abbey's friends. And I was acquainted with the manager at the time. And he said, well, here's this German fellow that's kind of desperate you might want to talk to. And so I walk over to this guy, and it's a German photographer who tells me he has a contract with a German publisher for a coffee table book about the Colorado Plateau. But he says, I'm not a writer, and I need a text to go with this book, with these photos. And I said, well, what a coincidence. I got this manuscript sitting on a shelf gathering dust. And so I went back to the manuscript and excerpted some chapters and adapted them to fit the introduction and the accompanying text for the coffee table book, which was then published in German. And that gave me the courage or the motivation to pursue my own book about the 120 canyons. And eventually that's the persistence paid off, and that turned into my first book publication.
How did you find a publisher?
How does anybody find a publisher? You knock on a lot of doors and you see where people that have written similar books, where they have been published. I had a few established authors take a look at the manuscript at some point when I was wondering if it's even worth pursuing. And they told me, a lot of them told me to hang in there, and that was worth pursuing, and also had connections. And that's sort of a thing in the literary world. If you want to make it as a writer in the long term, whatever that means, financially or critically, or just measured by your amount of output, you have to network. Networking is essential with, and not just with other with other writers, but with publishers, with designers, with artists, and also with your readers, of course. And so over the years, I like this collaboration aspect. Over the years, I have collaborated with various peoples, like the 12 books I bragged about earlier that I have to my name. Well, 4 of those are actually anthologies that I've edited, where I just had an idea and I wanted to pull different, I like this polyphony of voices where I pulled together different writers and sometimes artists to write about one thing, you know, from different perspectives. Like I did one on northern wildlife stories that I really enjoyed. And yeah, so it snowballs through knowing these people, you know, that opens other doors. You have connections that sometimes never, they sleep for 20 years and then you have another project or something comes along and you reconnect. And, you know, it's just, we don't do this alone. We all stand on the shoulders of others. Whether you write history, anthropology, or you do art, it's really a communal enterprise, and that includes the production of books, you know, the actual publishing, the design. My wife used to be a graphic designer, and we have collaborated on several, well, she wouldn't call it a collaboration, but she called me the art dictator, not the art director, because I had very fixed ideas what I wanted the book to look like. But I'm at a point now where I have walked away from publishers because they wouldn't work with me on the look of a book, because anything from the cover design to the title is the reader's first impression of who you are and what you're trying to sell. And so that's as important to me as what's between the covers of these books.
And that leads into the question of, we're having a downpour here right now. I hope that doesn't carry over into the audio and obscure anything we're saying. That leads into the fact that you've moved towards self-publishing, which used to have a pretty heavy stigma, but more and more established authors are heading that way. And perhaps you could discuss, especially for aspiring authors, that whole process. And as you mentioned earlier, how the book looks is important. And historically, self-published books have looked pretty terrible. And they don't necessarily anymore. Yours doesn't. And what sort of work goes into that, and how does that work as an author?
I wouldn't put it like you did, that I'm kind of totally moved towards self-publishing. It's true that my latest 2 books, the Nome book and then the Grand Canyon essay collection, No Walk in the Park, I have self-published. But for another project that I have in mind right now, I might go back with the traditional publisher, because it's just a project that requires a lot more input from production, from the production team than I'm able. I'm basically a hack when it comes to production aspects. Although now platforms like Amazon Kindle and Ingram Spark make it really easy, where anybody can basically publish a book, which of course is also part of the problem, because you get this inundation of ebooks and printed books, and it becomes harder and harder for the reader to separate the chaff from the wheat, so to speak. But you know, these things are foolproof. I've been lucky that I am married to a former designer, so we did everything like the layout and the cover design between the 2 of us. But you can farm that work out too. You know, you can hire freelance designers that do that for you, or you can use these templates that some of these self-publishing platforms provide, which are basically, from what I understand, foolproof. But I want to emphasize that not every book is a book that can be self-published. Like, there's still serious limitations. The quality tends to be really good, but there's limitations as to what kind of paper you can get, the kind of format you can get. And then, of course, there's also the cost factor. But for me, the big thing was that I published most of these 12 books I had published with either university or regional presses. And some of them are nonprofit, some of them are no longer in business. You know, the books that I published through them went out of print. And also, I ended up, because they don't have huge publicity teams like marketing and advertising teams like NOP, for example. So basically, they might have one person that tells you, yeah, we're going to send it out to a few review publications, but that's as much as we can do. So the onus of the work of promoting the book falls on the author. It's people that have never published a book, they think, oh yeah, once I got it published, I got it made in the shade. But that's, to me, that's when the real work begins, because you don't want to make a book that nobody reads because they don't get to see it, they don't know about it, don't hear about it. And since I was already doing, so authors are more and more expected to do that promotion and advertising themselves. Either they throw a lot of money in it, or they throw a lot of legwork at it, which is basically a full-time job in itself. And since I was already doing that for some of these smaller presses, I decided, you know what, I might as well reap the benefits, which in my book literally are a larger cut of the royalties when I self-publish. And then also, and I have to say it again, the art director is speaking full control of the project. And the Kenyan book, No Walk in the Park, that was actually the one that drove me to self-publishing when I pulled it from the University of Utah Press over disagreements in the cover design.
Okay. And I know just from being a reviewer that once you reach out, you're really good at following up. There's a lot of work involved, a lot of legwork in self-promotion, and you're not afraid to do it.
Nope. That's my full-time job. You know, as a writer, that's part of my job description. I'm not just writing these books. Some people do, they're okay with that, and then push them out in the world like unwanted children sink or swim. You know, I can't do that. It breaks my heart when I see all that work go into pots, you know. And yeah.
So for aspiring writers that are watching this, what are some of your pieces of advice that you would provide from your own experience?
The first piece of advice I would give is that you should identify of why you want to do this. What's your intention? What's your targeted audience? Are you just writing this so you can pass a copy of your book around to the family members and your friends? Do you want to change the world? Which I say good luck with that. Do you want to make a lot of money? Do you want to be reviewed really well and added to your resume? Several awards that you might get. So that's the primary step, or maybe the secondary, because first, when you already embark on the writing, you need to figure out what story you want to tell and what your intended audience for the story is. Other than that, what advice do I have? Do your homework. Like you mentioned that especially self-published books still have this reputation of being vanity projects, which is still largely true. And my personal approach in the two books that I've self-published is that I have very, very exacting standards. If I couldn't do the good work myself, I had to spend the money to get other people to do it. But I did not want to deliver shoddy work. I'm too much of a perfectionist, too much of a German to ever do that. Solicit the advice of experienced peers. I mean, don't be afraid. They may not want to read your 500-page manuscript about whatever arcane topic interests you, but every writer in my experience that I have approached, well, there are a few exceptions actually, is honored to be approached by a fledgling writer, and if they can make the time, is willing to share their experience. It's part of paying it forward, and I've done it now too to younger writers that or even, I say younger, not age-wise younger, but fledgling writers that embark on the venue and that have contacted me. A famous one is the so-called asking for blurbs, where you have these little promotional blurbs by writers that ideally, I have bigger names than you that you need to have on the back of your book that are now sort of an industry standard. And they have gotten so rampant now that nobody has time to write books anymore because they're too busy writing blurbs. So there's that flip side to that too. But, reach out. There's writers groups in most towns now that you can join for peer critique, and that's really helpful in the early stages to get that feedback from other people. And then just the other piece of advice, the final and maybe most important piece of advice, is to have persistence, to just not give up. If you really give up after the first rejection or 10 or 20, you're not really meant to be a writer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you touched on earlier your latest project. Why don't you talk about what you're doing there?
Yeah, so I can't even remember what brought it on. It might have been another article that I had in mind. Oh, yeah, it was an article about the Toolik Field Station up there in the Arctic, which is a big, largest scientific Arctic research center in the world, but it's also a place where writers get, artists, field artists, illustrators and so on get artist residencies. And I've written that article about Toolik and the interface between science and art up there for Alaska Magazine. And since it's such a strong emphasis on two things that are both important to me, which is natural history and the arts and science, I decided to put together a book entirely of field artists that work in northern Alaska. So it's another one of those anthologies, another one of those collaborative efforts where it's going to be a very illustrated, lavish sort of coffee style table book like the Ice Bear book, and showcases different styles of work by different artists. And I'll do the introduction. I'll curate the whole thing and have little mini essays that I'll write about various organisms, species, and so on, landmarks that are depicted in those artists' work. So I'm really excited about that. But since it's such an expensive book to produce, this is definitely not something that I'll be able to self-publish. As a matter of fact, I am looking for outside funding now, subsidiary funding, because I have two publishers that are interested, that are nonprofits that are saying we can't produce a book like that unless you are able to bring some money to the table. So I'm actually trying to find money to get this book together instead. It's not about making money, believe me. So I've applied, among other places, for a grant with the Alaska Wilderness League, a storytelling grant, and hope that there's some funding that will come from that.
Okay. We're bumping up on an hour, so we've probably reached the limit of our viewers' attention spans. But there's one more question I wanted to ask you about. I don't know that if I interviewed you before, if I really followed up on this one, but you had told me at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that once you left Germany, you never went back. And why have you just stayed?
What was the question?
You told me, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but at the time of the that I interviewed you before, you had said that you left Germany and never went back.
Yeah.
And why is that?
Well, there's nothing there for me. Basically, I kind of felt for the longest time when I was growing up. I mean, I had a good childhood and nothing to complain there, but I still felt this, like I was born either in the wrong place or the wrong time, possibly both. And so when I found finally that place in Alaska and the United States where I did feel like I belonged, that was home. You asked earlier, what's home? It's basically, this whole North American continent. And interestingly, they're saying this discontent in your own culture that I experienced in Germany, that is a prerequisite almost for becoming a cultural anthropologist. Freud wrote a book called The Discontent in Your Own Culture or something like that. And so there's always this, like, I'm really not part of it. I don't really belong here. And that drives a lot of people to immerse themselves in other cultures. And that's ultimately, it was, sure, in the initial phase, it was sort of like blue-eyed romanticism, idealizing the Native American, which there isn't just one. And, there are people like you and me, they drive cars and they listen to the radio and stuff. But that sort of was the impetus initially. And The German mentality in politics is just not something I can identify with. Um, if you think bureaucracy is bad here, or it was invented by the Germans, they sure perfected it. If you think it's a lot of paperwork here, red tape, and so on, you should go and live over there for a while. And the most important thing is there are no wide open spaces like the ones that I've gotten used to and fell in love with here. If you camp in a non-prescribed campground in Germany, it can't be somebody's backyard. They call that wild camping. And to me, I'm sorry, that's not wild camping. So the bar got raised and I was never able to back to. And I told my family, I love you dearly, but if you want to come and see me, you have to come over here and see me here. And they did, on occasion.
That's funny because you've missed some of those tectonic changes in Germany. You said you came over right before the wall fell. So.
Yeah, but there's big things happening here too. So you in one place you miss certain things, you in another place you miss different things. And I don't suffer from FOMO anymore, so or ever.
Good. Well, we should probably wrap up. It's been right up about an hour, and we can let their viewers do what they wish.
Sounds good.